From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted.
Wings by Paul Gallico. Judith drove over to Glendale Airport that morning to see her men off on a ferry job to Salt Lake City, with no sense whatever of premonition. None of them at any time felt any. Indeed, to Judith there was never anything of the supernatural about the affair. She was, after all, the level-headed daughter of a Glendale doctor. Everything that happened seemed to her natural and even logical, with a possible exception of the thing that occurred in the depth of her own soul and what was revealed to her there. Her father, Dr. Amos Sherrill, even was inclined to suggest a form of self-hypnosis, a semi-cataleptic state induced by altitude and lack of oxygen. But to Judith, with her warmth and great deep-seated womanliness above all, her capacity for and belief in love between human beings, it was much simpler and much more elemental. She was of the modern breed, born into a world that has added to its life the uncharted dimensions of the sky. She grew up with a consciousness of its mysteries. Jason and Mike were flying a DC-3 over to Salt Lake City to replace one that had developed a cough in a port motor. Judith always drove to the airport when Jason took off on a run. She would kiss him goodbye and then stand outside the gates waiting for that moment when the big ship went by her on the take-off run, roaring like all the dragons of antiquity. When the wind was right, so that it ran past the administration building, she would for a second catch a glimpse of Jason's wonderful profile, even through the window of the control cabin, and see him raise his right hand to the peak of his cap. It was his farewell to her, his love, because he would not take his eyes off the runway. Of Mike Trant, Jason Hawk's co-pilot, she would see nothing, but it was a comfort to know that he was there. Funny, ugly Michael with a harsh, dark face and the great kindly heart. She had a feeling that when the two were together nothing could happen to either of them. She loved them both, deeply and tenderly, but she was in love with Jason. She sometimes wondered to herself whether she had chosen Jason because he was among other things so strikingly handsome, while she herself was plain. For Judith was not a beauty, as beauties are accounted in the market. She was plain, but she had the deep inner beauty of soul and character that so illuminates a plain exterior. She was going on 27. Her mother had died when she was 15, and she had lived with her father since that time. When Judith fell in love with and became engaged to Jason Hawks, Dr. Sherrill slipped quietly into the background and became the friend of her lover, and of Mike Trent as well. For both men had been Judith's suitors. It had been a gay, bright courtship conducted by the two pilots. Jason Hawks was dramatically handsome. Mike Trent was as gentle and kind as he was ugly. Jason was gay and vital and seething with life and spirit, and flying the Big Ten geese was meat entering to him. If he was not so sensitive or imaginative as Trent, he made up for it with vitality and sheer male attractiveness. Judith's magnificence had cut through to him, though perhaps not to the extent that it had reached Mike Trent. No man can love beyond his own ability to estimate another human being, and above all he cannot love beyond the power of his imagination. To Mike, who had a lot of Irish in him, Judith's grave, deep wells of feminine power, her store of tenderness, and the welling inner beauty that she had were like music, like ancient songs. The relations of the three were by no means a triangle, chiefly because of Mike Trent's extraordinary nature. He was that rare type of man occasionally encountered who is happiest when he is doing something for others, no matter how trivial. Mike had made his run, so to speak, for Judith Ann had failed. Jason Hawkes was his friend. Judith was the woman he loved and would always love, and therefore he was content in the joy they took in each other. Because he loved them both, he was happy in their company, and they in his. Judith adored Mike, and a good deal of their splendid relations was due to her fine sense of tact and fitness. She never hurt him by carelessness. She had long had a curious feeling that somehow their three lives were bound up together. Once, in a serious moment, when the three had been drawn even closer together by the washing out of a ship and several passengers on a mountainside, where they had been found dead after an 8-day search, Mike Trent had said curiously and apparently incongruously, "If we ever crack up a ship, Jude, don't waste time looking for us on the ground." Judith's brow wrinkled and her dark head cocked a little to one side as she thought. "No?" she said finally. "Where?" Mike pointed overhead. "Get yourself plenty of altitude, Jude, if you ever come to look for us, because that's where we'll be." Jason grinned and said, "Mike has a quaint notion that he and I are going to heaven, if that's what he means." But the frown and the puzzled look had remained on Judith's face for some time, because she wasn't at all sure that was what Mike had meant. She parked her little roadster in the pilot's enclosure and went into the waiting room, where she ran into Swampy Smith, the instructor of the Red Arrow School, who said, "Hello, monkey. When are you going to learn to fly?" Swampy was an old-timer and was allowed to take liberties. He was one of the last great barnstormers. He could probably outfly any pilot on the field and might have been a senior pilot in the airline service, but his old barnstormer's pride wouldn't let him give in to ground direction. He called the airline pilots glorified chauffeurs and made a living out of the Red Arrow hangar down at one end of the field, teaching beginners how to hoist a couple of training jalopies around the field without killing themselves. Judith grinned so that her eyes disappeared and said, "Now, you know I'd never make a flyer, Swampy. I'm a female." Swampy was notoriously against women ever being allowed at the stick of any kind of flying machine. "Have you seen Jason or Mike around?" He led her out to the apron of the number 5 gate, where the empty DC-3 stood ready for flight. Jason and Mike were checking papers with the dispatcher. "My brave Birdman," said Judith. "Were they going to fly all alone to Salt Lake City without any pretty stewardess?" "There's a fog over Los Golopitos," said Swampy. It was January, but the sky over Glendale was brilliantly blue and cloudless, the sun warm. "Darling," said Jason, "can you bear it? Is he your hero in one of his less dramatic moments?" Then in answer to Swamp's remark, "We're not going that way. Mike and I are going sightseeing." The freight man came out of the office and said, "Hey, dopes! There's some air express to go. Oranges and grapefruit and a couple of crates of avocados. Joe's bringing it out." "Pack camels," said Judith unfeelingly, and watched them stow the crates. Mike Trent made her a low bow. "Hawkes and Trent, expressing and trucking, furniture moved, call upon us any time." When they were ready to go aboard, Judith went through the little ceremony they always had. She kissed Jason on his mouth with all longing and frankness and passion. Then she went to Mike and kissed him on the cheek gently, because it brought her close to his ear, where she could whisper, "Take care of him, Mike." Judith grinned into Mike's wizened, ugly face as he gave her the usual wink. For a moment they stood there, the plain girl and the ugly man, holding each other by both arms and looking into each other's face. Then the two pilots got into the big ship and flew right into the low yellow afternoon sun, and Judith saw Jason's hand to his cap as he coursed by and even caught a glimpse of Mike's uneven profile outlined behind his, like two heads on a medallion. Because they were flying into the sun, the ship was a black outline, a huge beetle, and then a dark flying cross that grew smaller and smaller until it vanished after the last faint whisper from its motors had died away. And that was the end of it, except for the faint message out of the fog, snow and storm, received at Las Vegas, asking for help and directions. Then those stopped. The ship never arrived at Salt Lake City or anywhere else. It vanished somewhere into the Sierra Nevadas. the most terrible time for Judith was the uncertain routine days of the search. Because she was Judith, there was no attempt made to conceal matters from her. As a matter of fact, one of the dispatchers called her up at 11 o'clock that night and said, "Hello, Jude. This is Crandall. You'd better get over here. There's some trouble." And that first night she spent in the radio room, staring with her dark eyes at the black metal boxes with their dials and indicators and knobs. Those boxes that were so silent except for cracklings and hummings, but from which might suddenly come forth the voice of the man she loved. It never came, nor was there any news of any kind. Only one thing was certain. By 4 o'clock in the morning the vanished ship was no longer in the air. There was no search that morning or that day because the fog had swept down from the north and blanketed the area. Dr. Sherrill took his daughter home and made her get some sleep. The next day the fog lifted, and the machines from Los Angeles and Las Vegas and Salt Lake City and Reno climbed into the air and swept the snowbound passes and the black walls and precipices of the mountain. Swampy Smith took off in his own pride and joy, his powerful, open cockpit Hornung Eagle that could achieve a ceiling of 21,000 feet. Because they had said they planned to avoid Los Colopitos, and he remembered what Jason had said about going sightseeing, he ranged across to Kingman and then headed north across the Grand Canyon and combed the sides of the Wasatch Mountains. He returned after 2 days with nothing to report. Curiously, it was at the end of the 7th day, when the search officially ended and hope was abandoned until spring and the melting of the snows might reveal the wreckage to some passing ship or chance prospector or sheep herder, that the conviction came to Judith that the men were still alive. It was that same night, following the announcement that the search had been abandoned, that Dr. Sherrill entered his house after a late call. It was past 3 in the morning. He tiptoed upstairs wearily and past Judith's room, the door of which was open, and he thought, in the first shock of hearing her voice from the darkness, that she was speaking to him. There was breathless agony and pleading in her voice. She said, "Oh, louder, louder! I can't hear you!" He stopped in surprise. She spoke again, sharply first, then trailing away to a despairing whisper. "Jason, Jason, Michael, oh, I can't hear you anymore. I can't hear you." Her father stepped into her room quickly and snapped the wall switch. She was sitting up in bed with her hands to her head, her hair lifted away from her ears and her eyes wide and dark and staring raptly into distances beyond all walls, the fixed stare of intense concentration of one who is listening. She did not hear her father or notice that the light was on until he said, "Judith, darling," and came over to her bed. Then she made a quick motion as though to silence his steps and suddenly turned a wild face to him and cried, "Father! Jason! Mike! I can't hear him any more." Then she clung to him and began to shake. He stroked her hair gently and said, "Poor Judith." "The dead?" Judith cried, "No, no, the living, not dead. They're alive somewhere. He spoke to me. I heard. I felt him, and then I couldn't hear or feel any more." "Who was it?" asked the doctor quietly. "Jason?" Judith was frowning deeply, and there was a puzzled expression on her face. She answered hesitatingly, I don't know. It was one of them. It must have been Jason, but I don't know." The doctor studied his daughter. There was no sign of hysteria. "What did he say? Was there a message?" Judith still had her hands pressed to her temples, and she shook her head slowly and repeated after him, "Message? I don't know," and continued to shake her head. Then suddenly she stopped and sat up and looked at her father and said flatly, "They're damn sick of eating avocados." The doctor nodded his head gravely. "If they were alive, they would be living on the fruit they were carrying." Suddenly Judith's wilted tension of her body relaxed. She began to sob. She shook her father by the lapels and pleaded with him, "Father, give me something to take that will let them through it to me again. Please, Father, there's so much around, so many things. I can't hear them any more." Help me, please." The doctor went downstairs and secured a mild sedative to quiet her nerves. He gave it to her, and then remained with her until she dropped quietly off to sleep. He remained awake for a long time, but there were no further sounds from her room, nor did she say anything more when she came downstairs the next morning. Judith tried to rationalize her experience. She knew that it had not been a vivid dream, that she had not been asleep, because she was her father's daughter, and had been brought up in an atmosphere of medicine. She was quite ready to mistrust her own senses and question the possible tricks that might be played by a hurt and distraught mind. Now, in the hard light of morning, she was not sure whether she had actually heard something or whether a thought had permeated her. But the lifeline to which she clung was the ridiculous logical incongruity of the message that had remained with her. She had nothing but contempt for the departed who rattled tambours, blew trumpets, and chose long-defunct Indians to deliver their messages. But she had a great feeling of strength and power in the love that was between her and Jason, and she added to herself, Mike too. She had felt it as an actual force that bound them together, far beyond words and phrases or even physical contact. Somehow she would have mistrusted any other message. They had been living on avocados and were fed up with them. It was like both of them. She was puzzled because she was not certain who had spoken to her. She had been almost sure that it was Jason, but she thought it strange that there had been nothing that made the identification positive. She set out to reason her way coldly to a solution because it was necessary to combat the almost panicky excitement there was within her. If she gave way to it, it might forever destroy the hope she now had of finding them. She must not again show the panic to which she had given way with her father the night of the occurrence. She sat in her study and summoned logic. She began with the premise that Jason and Michael were alive. They must be injured, or they would have come out. They must have been trying to communicate with her for many days. Then their communication had not been an accident, but a reception, even of the fragment, had been an accident. Somehow, for that brief electric moment, the lines had been cleared. What had clogged them for the rest of the time? Had it been she, or her situation? She tested herself, recalling the sleepless nights she had spent. Surely she had been in tune, had lain there raw and suffering. Was the house shutting her in? Might she be closer if she went into an open field? She felt no nearer a solution, and the need for speed was driving her close to panic. They could not live forever on the food they had. She began to tremble, and her head felt compressed as though by shrinking loops of steel. Her feeling of loss was gone, but in its place was the awful sense of futility and inadequacy that was blocking her from answering a cry for help. And then suddenly, with all the deep sonorous clarity of a great ringing bell, a bell that pealed joy and freedom, there came to her the curious half-forgotten thing that Michael Trent had said to her. "If we ever crack up a ship, Jude, don't waste time looking for us on the ground." It brought her up standing, flushed and breathing hard, her eyes burning like lamps set in windows for loved ones, and in her ears the toss and ran. Earthbound, earthbound, earthbound. Search for them where they dwell. She would find Swampy. Swampy would take her there where she could find them again. When Judith drove up to the Red Arrow hangar, Swampy recognized her car and strolled over. "Swampy," she cried, "I want to go up. Will you take me? High?" Swampy said, "Okay, monkey. Want to air out a little, huh? You're smart. We'll take the Eagle and go after a little altitude. Nothing like airing out when you're feeling low." He got her helmet and goggles and a warm leather jacket and strapped her in. They were at 5,000 feet and moving on to 6 when Judith's eye found the altimeter in the front cockpit. She began calling on Jason. She called to him with her voice and with her being. She called to Mike too, and she leaned her head against the front of the cockpit and cried bitterly, the tears gathering inside her goggles. There was no reply. There was no repetition of the vital, vivid experience of the night before. At 10,000 feet, She had a better grip on herself. The earth was half hidden by broken cloud banks. She forced herself to calm. Perhaps she had been over-eager. There was but one sensation of which she was definitely conscious, and that was a sense of freedom, of having shed so much of the terrible load the earth places upon us. It was not only a physical liberation that she experienced, but a psychic and spiritual one as well. She was going through the lift and exaltation that come to all depressed people when they air out, as Swampy expressed it. There is no haven as sweet and gentle as the sky for the sick and the sore in spirit. But free as she felt from the million and one cross currents of the life below, she could get no answer from the men she called. At 13,000 feet she noted that the nose of the ship was no longer high, and that the pitch of the motor had changed. She turned around and looked at Swampy, and pointed upward with one hand. He shook his head in negation, and when she pointed again insistently, he suddenly cut the gun and shouted at her above the sound of the idling motor and the high tune of the wind in the wires. "That's enough! Haven't got any oxygen on board. It's freezing up there." She turned around, and Swampy let the ship drop earthward motorless in a flat glide. And suddenly, with a rush as though it had swooped upon her, and only for a brief second, the man she loved was with her. And then he was gone, blocked off, shut out as though a door had slammed. There had been no message, but she knew that her name had been called, and that for one brief moment she had been conscious of a love such as she had never known before. The opening and shutting of the door had been so rapid and decisive that she whipped around instinctively to look at Swampy. She saw that he was shaking his head like a fighter who had been stunned. He grinned at her and said, "I was dozing off. Hang on, monkey. We're going down." And then Judith understood and knew what she must do. When they rolled up to the line, Swampy helped her to the ground. "Feel better?" he said. Judith was as taut as piano wire, and she saw herself moving as though she were detached and in a dream. She said, "Swampy, I want to learn how to fly." The pilot grinned at her fondly and said, "Okay, baby. I thought you'd get around to it some day. When do you want to start? Tomorrow? We can get you your student license, and Doc Stedman can give you your physical in the morning." Judith put her arm on Swampy's shoulder, and he was surprised at the power of the grip of her fingers. She spoke to him slowly in a low, clear voice, as if in that way he might understand. "Swampy, I want to learn at once. Now. I've got to be able to fly. Don't ask me any questions. Just help me. Every minute counts. How long will it take?" Swampy looked at her curiously, no longer smiling. There was something so powerful and pathetic in her earnestness. "You've got to have 50 hours to get a license," he said gravely. He was weighing her and the stuff she was made of. "You'll find you won't want to do more than a couple of hours a day, maybe 3. It's damn hard work and tiring." "I'll do 10 hours, Swampy. More. 14. I must. I must." She was in such a panic inside her that he might not understand, might block her through not understanding. And yet if she tried to tell him... He was suddenly sharply suspicious and said, "What is this, baby? You haven't any nonsense in mind about Jason and Mike? The best pilots in the country look for them." "No," said Judith. "No nonsense about Jason and Mike. Word of honor, Swampy. I want to fly the Eagle alone. In time, Swampy. While there's still time. Will you trust me? Will you help me?" Swampy looked at his wrist. It was 2 o'clock. "Come on, baby," he said, and nodded with his head toward her car. He got into the driver's seat and drove across the field to the office of the doctor who looked after the health of the pilots. When Dr. Stedman came out, he said, "Student pilot, Doc. Give her the works. She starts when you're finished with her." The next days were to Judith nightmarish because of the recurrence of detail. She lived with a roaring engine in her ears, and the jumpy motions of the little training ship, and the sight of Swampy's helmeted head in front of her eyes, and his signals, and the sudden jars of countless landings. She was, of course, useless the first 2 hours, simply because of the tension created by her terrific concentration on the job, until Swampy broke it by making her fly in rhythm to his arm motions, which he waved to a time beat like a conductor leading an orchestra. They rested 15 minutes after each hour, for though Judith begrudged the time, Swampy insisted upon it. He took her home at dusk, and she went to bed without eating, and was asleep almost at once. She was back at the hangar at 8 in the morning, grim, determined, tight-lipped. At 3 o'clock, Swampy turned her loose and stood grey-faced on the field below while she did her first 3 solo turns. The solo flight brought Judith the confidence as she had lacked, but gave her none of the joy and great exultation that attend the student's first solitary attempt. To her it was merely one step on the way to the accomplishment of her task. The hours and days that followed were dream hours and dream days. When Swampy was busy with other pupils, she rattled around the air alone, cutting endless circles and figure eights above the airport, learning to keep a wary eye on the incoming transports, getting the feel of her ship. She flew 13 hours one day and 12 the next. She learned night flying by the giant airport floodlights. She learned how to handle more power. She soloed everything in the Red Arrow hangar, including Swampy's beloved Hornung Eagle, and when she felt the powerful beast under her single control and made it hoist her to 4,000 feet, she smiled for the first time and cried, "Coming, Jason, Mike, coming, coming." The strain was refining her. She was drawn and white and had lost weight, but for her own purposes she was glad of that and ate very little. She was tired all the time, even after a night's sleep. She took her license in 4.5 days. By that time she was flying so well that she went through the test as routine. When she rolled up the line after the last landing, Swampy was shocked to see how she looked. Her eyes seemed larger because they glowed out of the white hollows of her face and were deeply shadowed underneath. Swampy, too, was close to the end of his nervous control. It had not been easy for him either. He said, "All right, baby. You're a pilot. You've done it. Now go home and get some rest." Judith climbed stiffly out of the cockpit. "What day is this?" she asked. "Friday." Judith counted days off to herself on her fingers, and fear came into her eyes. So long, Swampy. I want the Eagle tonight, after dark, please, for an hour." "Nothing doing, baby. You get some rest. You can fly it tomorrow." "Swampy," her cry was almost animal in its pain, "must I go down on my knees?" Swampy caught her. "All right, monkey," he said. "Whatever you say. Try to get some sleep. Come back at 9 o'clock. I'll have her ready for you." When she came back at 9, the squat, strong red ship was standing on the line with the motor idling. Swampy was standing beside her with a chute in his hands and offered it to her. She shook her head. No, straight flying. She was bulky with sweaters and warm clothing, which Swampy should have noticed. She climbed into the cockpit and strapped herself in, tried the controls, and roared the engines once. Swampy came over, looking worried. "What's up, baby? What are you up to?" For a moment Judith had a pang. The Eagle was his darling. Suddenly she leaned her head down over the side and said, "Swampy, get Turner, the traffic manager, to come over. I'll be back in an hour, maybe 2. I want to see him." She began to ease the throttle forward gently. "Judith," cried Swampy suddenly in fright, "what are you up to? Where are you going?" Her goggled and helmeted head came up bravely, and her cry rang clearly above the accelerating engine. "To find Jason! To find Jason and Mike! Stand clear!" Before Swampy could shout more than, "Judith! Come back, monkey!" she roared the red ship up into the night sky and the waiting stars. She felt joyous immediately. She had freed herself of the earth, and for the sheer power and movement of the upward rush she hauled herself aloft on her prop until she remembered to flatten out and continue her ascent in the long circle Swampy had taught her. By that time the airport was already a tiny patch of floodlight. She turned her face from the earth and looked to the stars. She was ready. She felt purified by her work of the past days, and if they were there, she would find them. She would climb so high that not a single stray cross-current from the teeming millions of humans below should interfere. If her love was still alive that night and called out to her, she would hear him. He thought first of Jason, and of the firm feel of his arms. and shoulders beneath his coat, and his beloved man smell, his light, far-away looking eyes, and his wonderfully clean mouth. Because she was for the first time alone at night, suspended between heaven and earth, she knew for the first time, too, why her man belonged to and in the sky. Judith let her thoughts dwell on gentle Mike and his great heart, and he, too, belonged to those clean, sweet, free, upper reaches, because he was warm and kindly, and kindness was to him a habit. She could not think of Mike as dead, non-existent. Jason was, well, Jason, but Mike was so simple and magnificent a person, an anchor and a rock. Her altimeter clocked 8,000 feet. She studied her instrument board, throttled back on the engine a bit, and continued to climb. Jason and Mike. It was the search for Jason that was drawing her into the sky. But it had been Mike who had told her when she could find them. Mike, whose depth and strength and fineness were such that he had found things aloft that Jason, perhaps, never even dreamed of. She exulted suddenly in them and cried as she climbed, though she could hardly hear herself, above the sweet, deep tone of the motor. Coming! Oh, coming, coming! At 13,000 feet she flattened out for a moment. It was a landmark. To that height she had been with Swampy. What lay above was uncharted. She found herself floating between firmament and firmament. Starlight above, earthlight below. The earthlight's topaz and twinkling, the stars diamond blue and white. She noted the great wall of the mountain ranges that ran to the edge of the long valley of lights beneath the San Bernardinos. 13,000 feet. Not yet, not yet. Above. It was more certain. Above they would be. There she could hear them. Again she tilted the nose of the ship upward. The climb was slower now. It took longer to notch the altimeter needle. She resisted the temptation to sharpen the angle. At 15,000 feet she found she was breathing more rapidly, and that suddenly she was drowsy. She remembered that Swampy had dozed for a moment, with her in the ship, and she shook her head to clear it. There was a pressure at the base of her neck. She rapped her knuckles sharply on the side of the ship, so that the pain would help her to keep her awake. She had hauled herself to 16,000 feet, and not until she tried to smile at the triumph did she realize that her face was stiff with the bitter cold. Higher, higher. Get yourself plenty of altitude, Jude, if you ever come to look for us, had been Mike speaking to her. She shook her head. No, she had said it to herself. She passed 17,000 without even noticing it because she was fighting her body that was gasping for oxygen. The cold was like the stabbing of knives now, and her fingers were numb on the stick and her feet on the rudder boards. But she could still work them. She kept on. Past 19,000 her distress became almost unbearable, and she had to fight desperately every second against the hot rasping pain in her chest, and the giddiness in her head, and the deadening numbing cold. Because the needle refused to move, she increased the climbing angle. Her goal was 20,000, and the figure on the dial had a magic that drew her on beyond any suffering. Light and darkness flashed before her eyes, and bright flashing spears darted through her head. Only through suffering shall you attain. To love greatly is to suffer. Go higher, higher. For countless centuries, men had been turning their eyes upward to the sky, always upwards. She was there. She had reached it. The needle had touched 20,000, dropped back, went forward again and stayed. She reached for the throttle but felt nothing. She saw that her hand was on it, the fingers crooked and pulled back. The roar died away to a gentle hissing. Somehow she eased the ship into gliding position, lifted her face upward, and cried aloud through her bleeding lips, "Jason, Jason! Mike, I'm here!" She strained and wrestled at the strap of her safety belt with the force of the effort she was making. With what was left of her senses she was striving to make of her body a great receiving set. He came to her immediately with a rush and a warmth of enveloping love so strong and vivid that she felt it almost physically, and in her reeling brain grew the pictures of where they were, the half-shattered plane on its belly, on the flat, steep, rocky, half-snow-covered slopes, the twin peaks that towered above them, and the mountain that was shaped like a Spanish woman, mantilla draped. She heard no sound actually, but the high whine of the frosty wind on the taut wires and the voice that spoke to her played upon her the way the wind played upon the wires, in antiphony and deep tones of pain and anguish and love. For the man who had come through her was badly hurt, and with the last of his strength she knew that he was sending out his love to find her and bring her to them. The plane rocked and tossed in its descent from the high cold silences as shaken and racked as the soul of Judith. She knew that her lover was dying, and dying was flinging out to her and enveloping her with the great flowing waves of his love. The picture suddenly became fainter and interrupted, and she cried aloud for him to come back to her, to leave with her this love that was filling her with such unutterable sweetness and beauty. And then the universe through which she was tumbling rocked with her name. It rang from every star and shattered every silence, twice called, once in agony, the last time in farewell. Judith! Judith! And then it was gone, and with every sensation of connection. It was not that she could no longer hear it or feel it. It was no longer there. She sickened and nearly died with a sense of loss. The world turned upon her, whirling topaz upon diamond, diamond upon topaz in great shapeless darkness. And with a shock she realized that the ship was spinning, wrapping up tighter and tighter. She would have let it spin in and crash her into the peace of never-lifting night, but there was something she still had to know. Sobbing, she fought to stick forward and pressed the rudder pedal and pulled out, but immediately fell into another and fought again and conquered, and this time gunned the ship into flying level. She saw that she was very close to the ground, with the airport lights a little to the north. She flew to them and circled until the floodlights came on, and with what remained of her strength and senses, slipped and bounced it into a landing. She was unconscious before the ship stopped rolling. But she came to when they were lifting her out of the cockpit. She saw faces that she knew: Swampy Smith, Turner, the traffic manager, 2 other pilots. She cried, "Swampy, Swampy, I know where they are. I've found them, Jason and Mike. You must go to them." She was lying on the ground, and Swampy was wiping the blood from her face with his silk neck scarf. He said, "Hush, child. What in God's name have you done to yourself?" "No," Judith cried again. "You must listen to me. I found them. One is dead. The other is still alive. You must go to him." Turner knelt at her side and asked, "Which one is still alive, Miss Cherrelle?" Judith knew that she had to face it. "I don't know. I don't know. I don't dare know. It must be. Oh, I don't know. I must know." She began to sob hysterically. Her father broke through the circle, took her in his arms and held her, gave her a swift of ammonia salts. Swampy said, "She says she's found them." The doctor stroked her head and said quietly, "Judith, where are they?" She closed her eyes for a moment to bring back the picture. "To the north of Las Vegas, in Utah, past the Twin Peaks on a slope. The ship is lying flat. One wing is torn off. You can see her if you pass to the west of the mountain, shaped like a Spanish woman wearing a mantilla." Turner was shaking his head slowly and regretfully, but Swampy Smith suddenly yelled, "Jupiter! Mount Dolores!" Turner said sadly, "It's impossible," he shrugged. "Poor child. Grief. Brooding." "A fire," Judith said. "Smoke drifting upward. Many crates and boxes broken open. The cabin is intact." Swampy jumped to his feet. "Damn it!" he shouted at Turner and the 2 pilots. "You office flyers! What do you know about the air? I'll go, Judith. If I leave now, I can make it by dawn. If they're there, I'll find them." He was rewarded many times over by her smile. "They're there," she added, and closed her eyes. She was being carried into the pilot's room when she heard the zooming roar of Swampy's take off in the Red Eagle. She remained there overnight. She was still there the next day, shortly after 11, when Swampy came rocketing down out of the sky in a diving landing and fish-tailed right for the administration building, dodging a taxiing transport. He was out on a wing while it was still rolling, waving an arm. Someone raced in and got Judith. She came out in time to see him running toward them, shouting, "Found them! Found them! They're there! One of them is still alive!" "Which?" Judith spoke the word. Swampy stood before her. Honey, I'm sorry. I couldn't tell. I couldn't get low enough. I just saw him wave. I spotted the country. It was where you said they'd be. They can be reached through Kawatachi Pass. We'll have him out in 24 hours. I'm sorry I couldn't tell, honey. But by this time, Judith was sure she knew. She would not let herself hope. All through the terrible suspense of the weary trek on horseback from Almores through Chauhatchi Pass, she told herself dully that Jason was dead. He had cried her farewell, but before he died he had shared with her such love as few women can know from man. 100 times she thought back to the great soaring, singing strength that had come winging to her through the air, the tenderness and passion that had filled her and stirred her in response to such love as she had never before known. And she thought that she had loved Jason as utterly as any woman can love. Jason then was dead, and because so much of her was dead too, she was able to go on and see for herself. Yes, see for herself. She caught herself on that phrase. Why, if she was certain, why had she not waited until the news was confirmed by wires from the search party? Why had she come? What were those terrible fears and doubts that welled up darkly from deep inside her like the great sighing bubbles in ancient tar pits? There was a sudden shot from up front in a shot. They had been traveling a narrow trail on the side of a steep, bare, rocky slope. The caravan of men and horses, and the lone girl stopped and looked. Over the hill, around the bend, they could see ascending a thin streamer of smoke. With a rush they spurred their horses forward and came around the corner. The silver ship was there, on the slope side, on her belly, the undercarriage washed out. One wing was torn off. There were broken crates of oranges and grapefruits and avocados strewn about. A little way from the ship a fire barely smoldered. 2 figures lay there, one on either side, motionless. The party rushed forward wildly, shouting. Dr. Stedman in the lead. Now that it was to be, Judith found herself calm. She watched the doctor bend over both figures. Then he straightened up with a little cry and said, "Jason's still alive. He's still breathing. We've got a chance to pull him through, but Mike's gone." So that now at last she knew, beyond any doubt or recall. The others crowded around the doctor, working over Jason. Judith went slowly over to the other still figure, knelt in the snow and gazed at him, and marveled at the great beauty that had come upon the face that had been so ugly, the beauty that must have come when he said good-bye to her. Yes, it had been Michael who had got through to her because of the kind of man he was, and because of the way he loved her. Michael who had been with her on that unforgettable night. Michael who always had been, who always would be. She wondered how long she had known it was Michael she loved. Oh, for a long, long time. Had it not always been Michael? When they disappeared, she must have known then. That first night in her home when Michael reached her. She had been blinded by her feelings for Jason, or she would have known who it was. Michael, Michael, always Michael. Every question was answered now. Yes, each and every one was answered fully by the mute clay there that she had loved. All with possibly one exception. There was a cry from the other group, and it opened up a little. It was Swampy who called to her. "Judith! Jason's coming around. Come here." That was the question to which she knew no answer. Still kneeling by Michael's side, she stared over at them through the mist of tears that came at last, and did not know whatever she would do. "Judith!" Swampy called again. "Jason's coming to. He's all right." She rose very slowly to her feet. "Yes," she said. "Poor Jason. Poor, poor Jason."